bonjour à tous, bienvenue. Bienvenue pour cette deuxième journée du New York Forum Africa. Bon, on est ravis de vous accueillir. Hier, on a eu des interventions passionnantes, à la fois de la part des chefs d'État ou anciens chefs d'État, et puis de chefs d'entreprise. On a parlé d'infrastructures, on a parlé d'intégration du continent, on a parlé de capital humain. Ça a été absolument passionnant et je pense que ça va être au moins aussi bien aujourd'hui. On va commencer les débats avec le premier invité, Lionel ZINSOU. Lionel, n'hésitez pas à l'applaudir parce que il est quand même très bon et il va vous le démontrer. Bienvenue Lionel, asseyez-vous. Alors vous êtes, asseyez-vous. Vous êtes le président de PAI Partners, qui est un colossal fonds d'investissement européen, leader. Et donc on va commencer la journée, je suis désolé, mais par parler un peu d'argent. Je sais bien que c'est un peu vulgaire, mais ça fait partie de la vie. Et j'avais envie de vous demander, alors vous avez une double casquette, hein, vous êtes un grand financier, puis vous connaissez en plus l'Afrique, vous êtes vous-même...
Africa very well, and you are partly Beninese. And so, is it profitable to invest in Africa? Well, the answer is yes. It's very profitable. But first of all, I would have to say thank you and good morning to everybody who's been inviting me here today. It's so kind of you to have come so early this morning. And contrary to what we say, Africa is always against the intuition. And contrary to intuition, the statistics of the United Nations and the CNUSED have shown that based on a study of the geographic divisions, the different, we can see that the rate of profitability right now is Africa. And so this is a contrast with the fact that the perception that we can see is that it is the most risky continent, and that we should imagine that the profitability should be threatened and would be followed by all sorts of problems of security and business investment. And so you have a real separation between the reality, which is a good investment, and then the perception that we have, which, of course, that would have a weak profitability in a risky continent. And so I think that we have to work with the reconciliation of this perception and the reality of the situation today, because Africa, and it's a real potential. So now, what is happening now? The different ranking agencies, they don't understand, or what? Well, this is one of the good news in the past 10 years. They've done some rating and they've given classifications of different countries, and we've allowed them to have an access to the international capital. And we call upon some of the big companies in Africa. I think that it's probably the petroleum sector which has contributed to the stabilization and the improvement in life in Africa. But there are things that are more important than cassava, cotton. Of course, these are very respectable. But all of these invisible things that are playing a role, and they're in financial aspects. And so that, for instance, we can see that the phosphate country, for instance, had such a huge debt at a very favorable debt. And then I think that this was, they had an issuance of bonds that was very important, and I think that's a good sign for Africa. This happened a couple of weeks ago, and I think we're going to be calling upon the market again. But we do have governments, including the government in Gabon, who are going into the world financial markets, and you also have different companies, and you have an internal financial market. In other words, the savings in Africa and what's going to finance Africa. Yesterday, we discussed a little bit of investments in Africa. We were talking about foreign investment. And of course, foreign investment in Africa is progressing, but it is just it is a support system. And so what is important, and this is going to be mentioned by my colleague in a minute, is that the savings in Africa is, first of all, here and important. And if we can look at three different figures, if we look at the different exchange reserves, the different central banks, we have $500 billion in the central banks in Africa. And so the different pension funds in Africa, and especially in the English-speaking Africa, because after all, they have French habits, so they don't like that word pension, but they have the retirement funds. And in much of English-speaking Africa, you have, again, $500 billion in those pension funds. So this is interesting because when you accumulate savings for your retirement, you have the possibility of having long-term investments. And when you have, for instance, a possibility of the African youth to have a retirement after 25 years, you can go ahead and manage that retirement fund, and you can finance infrastructure with that. And that, of course, can be amortized over 10 or 20 years. And then, of course, you also have 29 different financial markets in Africa. They're quite unequal because Johannesburg, after all, is 80% of the wealth of Africa and 80% of the GDP in Africa. But 29, because I think you have to remember 500, 529. Now, 29 is the different stock markets, and some of them have world level or world ranking levels like Accra, Lagos, and Johannesburg. And these are very important figures because it means that we can issue shares, we can issue bonds. And of course, the African savings, which has not been very dynamic, and it's been in different banking systems, it is now starting to become active for the development of Africa. And so it is Africa that can finance the development in Africa. And when I say Africa, of course, I'm from the diaspora, you understand, because I am an immigrant who was born in the 14th district of Paris and went to the 17th district in Paris. What a trip that was, okay. But at the same time, I'm totally Beninese. And so the diaspora is actually financing Africa up to the same amounts of the public assistance for development. So this is a scoop, if you like, the investment on the part of the diaspora. And of course, we can see that the qualitative and the technological investment being done by other countries and foreign countries into Africa is important, of course. I'd like to ask another question, which is tied to this. We can see that in the world markets, we can see the creation of different funds, and we're printing up a lot of money in England, Japan, and Europe, and so on. And this, of course, is there some kind of a risk in Africa because of this problem? Well, no. The bubble in Africa, it would be the idea of paying real estate for a too high a price, or paying foreign companies at a too high a price, and so that if, for instance, the developed countries are trying to get out of the crisis, Africa actually has a better macroeconomic stability than Europe and North America, because Africa has a type of an equilibrium between the exchanges. They're in a constant excedent of payments, and it is the only continent which has an excedent in terms of over a long period with China. And so we can see that has a certain stability in terms of exchange rates, and in terms of the GDP, and in terms of the inflation rate, which is under 5%, which is a very good performance compared to the developed countries. And of course, it is reducing its public debt. And so, for instance, we don't have, like, for instance, the Italian Republic, 105% in terms of the national debt compared to the GDP. And Africa is much more stable in terms of macroeconomic terms. And of course, we'd have to explain this in detail before people will understand this. So it is much, maybe we should send Monsieur Francois Hollande to Africa to learn something. Yes, Francois Hollande often comes to Africa. And through, of course, his work in Africa, and of course, Laurent Fabius, as you have noticed yesterday, and as well as other members of the French government, they often come to Africa. And of course, I think that we ought to set up some kind of a Franco African fund, which would be public and private, so that together the different private sectors in France and Africa could try to accelerate the development in Africa. Because what we would like to do is accelerate the development. In Africa, Africa is progressing, the middle class is emerging, and it is becoming a real magnet in terms of investment and world investment. But this, of course, is not enough in order to guarantee the social equilibrium. It is assuring the macroeconomic equilibrium. But of course, we're going to have to create jobs for the 15 million young people in Africa. And so we still have a lot of progress to make, which is quantitative in terms of growth. If we want to reduce the number of poor people and increase the number of young people who have a job, then of course we have the same objectives. We'd have to come up to at least 8% of unemployment. And I think that we're going to have to qualitatively develop a lot of things that would lead to more inclusion in terms of social development. We've only got 1 minute left. I'd like to talk about something that has nothing to do with money, and that is something that you have been involved with. I can see your daughter who's right here in front of us. Perhaps you could talk to us about your PAI. Well, yes, I'd like to talk about that. First of all, before discussing the foundation, well, listen, I'm not just a basketball player, because I was very tall, but I was a very bad basketball player. And so I became the leader of a company because I couldn't play basketball. And then worse than that, I became a banker. And when you're a banker, a business banker in the diaspora, then of course you say that you have to do something for my country. And so I pay taxes in my country. I don't have any remuneration, but consequently, with the complicity of my daughters, I have a source of, in terms of social and education issues, and also contemporary art, African art. And we have opened a museum of African art, and maybe this is the first one, maybe the first foundation that has been consecrated to contemporary African art. But I feel obligated to do something for culture and cultural industries. And I think that's interesting, even economically, because we're creating jobs, and we're tying this to creativity and production. Sometimes the governments are not too sensitive to this. But if you just look at, we have the Hollywood in Lagos. So this is a second source of production in terms of audiovisual productions. And so in Benin, sometimes we think that, if I can repeat an expression by Saunier, we say that we want to do something for culture, and we want to train children. We want to set up libraries and videothèques for public reading. And so we're like in many other countries. We just don't have any libraries in our high schools. We don't have any high school that has an internet connection. And so with our company, our foundation, we've given ourselves 50 years to try to produce and develop this foundation. But we want to try to equip all of the different school institutions in my country and Cotonou and so on with computer equipment. And of course, we have lots of people coming and visiting our museum. And we have a lot more visitors, in fact, than some of the great museums in Europe. And we have a very, very modest fund in order to support this museum. But we would say that we have not yet done enough. There are even some indicators, for instance, in terms of the African continent. We have so much more to do and so much more of an effort to make. But I think that we have to somehow give a pride of identity of African children. And I think that in terms of the contemporary artistic production, we have to give them a source of pride. And because they come to visit our museum, because they want to see what their patrimony could represent. And I think they find a new self-esteem in themselves, and I think it's very important for them. I think it is just as important as money, capital, absolutely. And I think it's very important, this cultural aspect. Thank you very much.